In case you missed it, tomorrow marks 22 months since President Cyril Ramaphosa first declared the national state of disaster. It's the legal umbrella, if you like, under which all COVID-19 lockdown rules are enforced, including the curfew and the risk of arrest for failing to wear a mask in public. Professor Dewald van Niekerk is the head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at Northwest University. He joins us now to unpack whether or not this measure is still necessary, amongst other issues, of course. Prof, it's great to see you. Thanks for making time for us here on Newzroom Afrika, channel 405. So more than 660 days of lockdown and counting. Is it still necessary to be under the national state of disaster?
No, thanks for having me. Yes, I think that the main question we need to ask is whether our situation still warrants the declaration of a state of disaster and whether we still adhere to the definition of what a state of disaster is. And currently there is positive and negative arguments towards the point, but I think if we look at it holistically, I do believe it's time that we transition to a more, can we call it, state of normality, and somehow exit the state of disaster, although there are certain requirements that still need to be in place, and I think that's the main reason why we still find ourselves renewing the state of disaster.
Yeah, and the question then, I guess, becomes, can those non-pharmaceutical interventions, I presume is what you're alluding to, can those stay in place without us being under a national state of disaster?
Currently, no, it can't. It must be regulated through some form of legislation, and currently that's why we actually have the state of disaster still in place, is that enforcing of mask wearing and social distancing, etc., can be achieved by the regulations under which functions under the state of disaster. Currently, we do not have any other measure in place that can allow for that. And unfortunately, this is not a new conversation. It is something that we've had with government for the past 12 months in saying that we need to look at other legislation. The reason being is the Disaster Management Act is very specific in that it's only applicable where other legislation does not adequately provide for the situation in which we find ourselves. And currently, no other legislation makes provision for these regulations. And I believe that under the Health Act, we can certainly look at transferring, as you could say, the regulations to fall under the Health Act, but that has not been done yet.
Yeah, and that, I presume, would be a parliamentary process, which, again, may take a long time, especially in a context where the actual building of Parliament is no longer what it used to be.
Absolutely. I mean, we're looking at a 3-month process at least to get those regulations approved, although it can be fast-tracked according to the National Health Act. I believe we can do that. But whether there's political appetite to do that, currently I'm not quite sure, because I think it's very easy to just renew the state of disaster and not go through such a huge process, which would include quite a lot of public participation, etc., which could then make that period of 3 months a reality.
What is interesting, of course, is that the state of disaster itself could be removed and reintroduced at any period if, especially, we find that people's behavior isn't necessarily where the government would like it to be. Is that enough of a reason to at least test the waters?
Well, I would say yes, but we should be cautious.
Yeah.
The thing is, we're still in the midst of a pandemic. We've just actually starting to transition out of the fourth wave. Every now and then there's a new variant that comes along. So I would, from a disaster risk perspective, caution that we do not make knee-jerk decisions yet. Remember, the Disaster Management Act provides for a proactive approach, and I think it's good that we still use that, but we must make our decisions based on good science, and I think we've got much better science now than in early 2020, and we must base our decisions on that. Also looking at the fourth wave, what have we learned? What have we learned now with inoculations? That's now almost at 40% in South Africa. And what can we meaningfully do through a risk lens going forward? And I think that's the most important question that we need to ask. It's not a matter of this total prevention, because we know it's not going to happen. But what can we do in ensuring that people don't feel that their civil liberties are imposed on any longer?
And I guess a question that's equally as important to ask is, do we honestly reckon that people are walking around with masks because they fear arrests or because they buy into the fact that masks work?
That's a very good question. I would love to see some research on that topic. I haven't seen anything yet. But it's definitely a question that is being asked. We haven't measured that kind of social behavior and the successfulness of it yet, I haven't seen research in that regard. But it would be interesting to look at that and to see to what extent is that actually contributing to lowering the infection rate.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I guess it's impossible for us to tell with the state of disaster remaining in place. But another issue that has been ventilated, at least in public discourse, is around this perception, at the very least, that the national state of disaster allows the government, some instances, particular ministers, to make decisions around governance without oversight. How unique is that to what we're going through in South Africa? In other words, do we expect oversight to still be a possibility in any other country in the context of something like a global health crisis?
You see, we're a constitutional democracy, so in definition, there must be oversight to all of these decisions. When you say a state of disaster, whether it's at local, provincial, or at national level, it means certain extraordinary measures must be put in place, and most of the time they are quite time sensitive. And therefore, when we do this as a government, when we make that decision, there must be a realization that certain powers are being shifted, and they're not being shifted necessarily through a total democratic process. Although you could argue the law is in place, therefore it is democratic in nature. But the actions relating to that can be, people can overstep their responsibility, and they can overstep the type of authority that they are given by the Disaster Management Act. So it's absolutely open for abuse. Whether that has happened, I mean, everyone's got their own opinion in that case. I do believe that there's been some very interesting decisions that kind of baffles the brain sometimes, why that has been made and why that has been made under the Disaster Management Act in the state of disaster. But this is still emergency law. And emergency law makes provision for certain, call it freedoms, that must be given away by the civil populace in order to address a certain situation. And it's definitely a problem. It's not only a problem in South Africa, it's a problem worldwide. Because you can, as a governing party, do quite a lot of things under the state of disaster. The Disaster Management Act initially was set up to ensure that we do have these oversights, but please remember that a new structure was created outside of the Disaster Management Act, which was used. And therefore, I believe this is where the main problems actually happened.
Fascinating. Especially in a context where, again, we, at the start of this pandemic, granted not much was known, but many will point out that buying short-sleeve shirts and black flip-flops was banned under the same piece of legislation. That said, though, there is, what I sense, a growing, call it, agitation for the state of disaster to be lapsed, for the law itself to be recalled, for lack of a better term. In fact, if we listen carefully to some of the scientists themselves, there are reasons why that could happen. If the government does not concede to it, though, what kind of resource, if any, can anybody take to challenge the government? Is it another string of litigation?
It is. If we look at the past history, the past 2 years of challenges to the Disaster Management Act, I don't think there was one case that was successful. And it's a very robust piece of legislation. And therefore, I think that's why nothing stood up against the Disaster Management Act. We could possibly see that happening again, could see people challenging it. But I think the government must clearly look at the situation and make an informed and intelligent decision going forward. And what I see currently is the main and probably the only reason is holding these few other regulations in place. And the question is definitely needs to be asked, how can we do this a bit differently? I think we've wasted too much time not addressing this question. And now it's becoming an issue, and I promise you the state of disaster will be renewed as long as they feel that we need these regulations to be in place. But there must be some transition.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, nothing's been said yet. Something tells me if history is anything to go by, a statement will arrive sometime this afternoon. Professor Dewald van Niekerk, great chatting to you. Thanks so much for making time. Professor van Niekerk is the head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at the Northwest University.